The New York Times had published a couple of op-eds and stories basically looking at the transgender debate from a more, not even conservative side, I think just rational side, which is to say J.K. Rowling's not a bigot or a transphobe because she wants to protect women's spaces. Conservatives who think that it's unfair to have biological men in women's sports are not transphobes. I mean, kind of just adding a little bit of a voice of reason into the debate, which is itself was shocking from the New York Times, but they did it. And then some staffers decided to coordinate with GLAAD to send a letter. There was one from staff, one from GLAAD and New York Times contributors to New York Times leadership, claiming that the paper was giving a platform to transphobia and was actively harming transgender people. Well, the New York Times responded to this by actually releasing a statement in which they said they were no longer going to tolerate reporters and staff members siding with activist groups on any side of the political aisle. And the follow-up reporting was that they were supposedly starting to discipline the people who had signed on to this letter, although I haven't seen any evidence of that. Mm-hmm. But I mean, compare that to what happened at the New York Times just a couple of years ago when they published an op-ed from Tom Cotton saying that the National Guard should be sent in to quell the riots in the summer of 2020. What happened at the paper then was that the editors who had even had this op-ed go through their email inbox were forced out of the paper. If you go to the Tom Cotton op-ed on the New York Times website, I'm pretty sure there's still an editor's note at the top of it saying that it should have never been published. And the way that the staffers were able to get all of this done was, again, a social media shaming campaign where they created this little hashtag and all of the staff members used the hashtag in their tweets and then copy and pasted this line saying that publishing this op-ed put Black New York Times staffers' lives in danger. And that's sort of the common refrain, isn't it, from the woke left, that if you disagree with them in any way, shape, or form, you're actually harming them. Mm-hmm. And not just because of what your policies might do, but your language itself is violence. Mm-hmm. And so that's why they are so keen on using violence to respond, because they believe that they're acting in self-defense. It's a really warped worldview. But I mean, the difference in the New York Times, you have staffers being fired for publishing a Tom Cotton op-ed to now a few sign on to this letter with GLAAD, and the New York Times is actually pushing back. So there's a bit of a sea change happening right now.
Yeah, someone once had this great line. I forget who it was. It was probably an anon because it was actually clever. It was like, it was right-wing free speech is violence and left-wing violence is free speech.
Yeah.
That's basically the argument.
It's so true. I mean,
culture.
Look at what happened at Stanford with Judge Duncan. You had a diversity dean go up and ask if the juice was worth a squeeze. And the assertion in follow-up opinion pieces from her, and there was a piece in the New York Times this weekend. My friend Tim Rosenberger is the president of the Federalist Society there, and they quoted him, but they also quoted some of the liberal protesters. And they've always said this. The left on campus has always said this, which is, if we interrupt a speaker, it's because we deserve our free speech too. And it's like, okay, you're preventing someone else from giving a talk that is scheduled. There's probably a Q&A session at the end during which you can ask your questions. The whole idea that the university is trampling on your free speech because they don't want you to interrupt someone else is like so cuckoo brains crazy. I mean, I don't know if they're trolling or if they truly believe this stuff. But based on the fact that most of them are in therapy, I would say they probably truly believe it, because it takes a very psychotic person to think that someone's speech is actively hurting you. Yeah.
Is there a distinction to be made between how the woke people inside some of these mainstream publications treat sort of centrist libs at the company versus how they treat, say, the token right-wing columnist at their company? Because it seems like to me, or maybe he's just like fully kept at this point, like a George Will at the Washington Post or a Ross Douthat at the New York Times don't actually come under ire from their own publication staff as often as like the centrist libs at these publications do. Can you unpack what that distinction might actually look like?
Well, one of the distinctions is that the centrist libs tend to be reporters for the most part, whereas the sort of token Republican or conservative tends to be an opinion columnist. Mm-hmm. And those divisions are still like functionally separate. The reason that the people who published the Tom Cotton op-ed took so much flack is because although they're opinion editors, they're still editors, right? Mm-hmm. So the change that's happening in newsrooms is not we should just publish left-wing opinions all the time. They actually want to reshape what journalism is.
Mm-hmm.
They want to reshape what's happening on the news side to be more progressive. So they're changing the language that's in style guides. They are changing the concept of searching for the truth or trying to be objective or unbiased in favor of fighting on behalf of marginalized voices and speaking truth to power. So anyone who doesn't go along with that shift is going to be thrown under the bus.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the people at the papers who are fighting back are centrist libs. The Republicans and conservatives, again, are on the opinion side, so they don't really have an active role in what the ethics of the paper are.
Mm-hmm.
They're just kind of writing their sort of anodyne right-wing sort of takes. And also, a lot of these people have been there for a really long time, so they're sort of entrenched. There was a major backlash when Bret Stephens got hired at the New York Times. If you remember, he was accused of being a climate denier. Mm-hmm. And Bret Stephens, of course, is one of the most like non-conservative conservatives, as most of these people who write for the major papers are. And no one complains about him anymore because now he just gives lip service to leftist ideas in the name of fighting the bad Republicans.
CC David French.
Right. The conservative case for being a total cuck.
So you mentioned how the ethics of journalism itself are under attack now, and there's a fascinating story to be told about what's gone on at Politico specifically with their style guide. You go into it in your book a little bit. Walk us through what exactly is happening there and what it means for every single word that you read at any major publication.
Politico is one of the greatest examples of the woke takeover of the mainstream media. I know the New York Times and the Washington Post get a lot of attention, and we've, of course, been talking about them a lot here. But I think there's just such a perfect through line between woke staffers at Politico sort of finding each other and realizing that they were all there, to using what little power they had to exert a ton of influence on the journalistic process. So a couple of years ago, when Politico was changing over the staff on its Playbook newsletter, which used to be sort of the must read for everyone in DC, it's pretty much trash now. They decided in the interim of bringing on these new staff members that they were going to have a bunch of guest authors. One of the guest authors was Ben Shapiro, and this was unacceptable to the woke young staffers in the Politico newsroom, a lot of whom were not even reporters or editors, had no power whatsoever. Some of them were like graphic designers. I mean, you'll often find it's the most low on the totem pole people who are trying to make themselves indispensable by becoming the experts on DEI or racial equity or whatever the buzzword of the day is. So
it's a short circuit to power.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you can't fire them because then you're a racist, right? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of perfect for them. It's a way of specializing your career. So they start complaining about Ben Shapiro. They send a letter to the editor. To the editor's credit at Politico, he did not apologize for having Ben Shapiro. He basically told them to pound sand, although he was a little too nice about it, in my opinion. But according to several former Politico staffers that I spoke to who were there at the time, this was basically the moment that all of these young woke staffers realized how many of them there actually were. And they were dedicated moving forward to basically causing a ruckus whenever it was convenient for them. They started a union as well so that they would be further protected from retaliation if they continued with their mob tactics. So shortly after the Ben Shapiro incident, Gabby Orr, who now writes for CNN, had written a really great long-form piece about the Republican efforts ahead of the midterm elections to protect women's sports from biological men. And she quoted two conservatives in it. She quoted Stephen Miller, the former Trump advisor, as well as Terry Schilling, who you've had on the podcast, American Principles Project founder and president. And they said pretty, normal things about biological men competing in women's sports. It's unfair. It's weird. It's creepy, blah, blah, blah. She also quoted Kate Oakley, who is a senior official at, I believe, the Human Rights Campaign. So obviously very progressive on the issue. So she covered both sides, and the piece I thought was very fair. I mean, I guess I'm biased from the left's perspective. But after this piece was published, Gabby was called into a meeting with Robin Turner, who was the director of diversity initiatives at Politico, a job title that should never exist, and several of her colleagues, because her colleagues had complained that she had published a transphobic article. And throughout the ensuing struggle session, I would call it, she was probed about the fact that she used to work at the Washington Examiner, which is a center-right outlet. So the implication was that she couldn't possibly approach this issue fairly or in the correct way because she must have been a secret closeted conservative. They told her that when she was quoting Stephen Miller and Terry Schilling, that she should have added context to inform readers that their comments were transphobic. She was supposed to actually quote a transgender individual. Simply quoting Kate Oakley from the Human Rights Campaign was actually not enough. And it was suggested to her at the conclusion of the meeting from Robin Turner that she should have sensitivity readers for any future articles she writes about transgender issues. Now, following that, it seemed like the Politico leadership decided that more needed to be done in order to convince the colleagues who complained that they were not going to let this happen again. So they actually brought in a group of transgender activists from various left-wing journalistic associations and activist organizations to come in and lecture reporters on how they were allowed to write about transgender issues. And this is unheard of in a newsroom, to have, 3 members of an issue lobby explain to a group of reporters how they're allowed to write about something.
It'd be like having hedge fund managers come in to lecture like Financial Times reporters.
Exactly. Yeah. Or having, Exxon come in and tell people how they're allowed to write about oil spills.
Yeah.
I mean, that's sort of the analogy. So they come in and they tell people that terms like mother can be offensive, that they need to use only non-gendered language in their reporting.
Person.
Yes, birthing person, pregnant people, person who menstruates. That's one of my favorites. And also that if you report on transgender issues from the conservative side, if you represent their voice, then you are actually violating journalistic ethics, because you can't, if you give a voice to transphobia and you are harming people, then you are no longer fighting on behalf of the marginalized, and that's a violation of journalistic ethics. And then in January of 2022, so a little over a year ago, they released a new style guide, and the changes to this style guide are vast and insane. They basically did what the trans activists told them to do. They got rid of gendered language. They said that reporters should use terms like pregnant people, people who menstruate. They should not use pregnant women. They should not use terms like biological man or biological sex, because that is transphobic. You're not allowed to use terms like so-and-so identifies as female, because identifies as suggests that they are not actually the gender that they claim to be. You're not allowed to say so-and-so was assigned at birth a certain gender, because that would imply that what they were born as is more important than what they identify. You see, you can't even... You get twisted up to a word pretzel.
You can't even talk about it.
You can't even talk about the issue. It's a way of just silencing debate on it entirely and making sure that you can't ever even approach covering the side that's skeptical of transgender ideology. And this is common in a lot of newsrooms that have made these changes. The Washington Post has started using pregnant people, for example. And I mean, it's really hard to overstate how big of a shift this is, because language leads directly to thought, right? So if you're constantly reading news articles that say a biological man just is a woman, and that people who are not women can get pregnant, eventually that starts becoming normalized in the way people think about issues. So this is a very insidious way of getting people to accept the progressive orthodoxy as the norm in society.